The night in Willow Creek was quiet, almost unnaturally so. The small suburban town had long ago settled into its routine of silence after dark, porch lights glowing faintly like fireflies, dogs barking at nothing in particular, the occasional hum of a car passing down the street. In one of the modest houses near the edge of town, Mary Carson sat alone at her kitchen table, a chipped mug of tea cooling in her hands. She had become used to the silence. In fact, she depended on it. 5 years had passed since her husband, David, had been killed in what the police had called a tragic accident. The word still tasted bitter, even when only spoken in her memory. Lost control on the highway, they had said. A quick death, they had added, as if those words could comfort a woman whose entire life had been ripped in half in one violent moment. Now, at 52, Mary lived in that same house they had once bought together with such excitement, though it felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The photographs on the walls, her and David laughing at the beach, the trip to New Orleans, the grainy selfie in front of Niagara Falls, were no longer warm memories. They were frozen ghosts, constant reminders of what she had lost. On the counter, next to the fruit bowl that hadn't seen fresh fruit in weeks, sat an old smartphone. It was scratched and slightly bent at the edges, useless by any modern standard. Mary kept it for one reason: it had been David's. The phone no longer worked, at least not in the way it once did. The number had been disconnected, the plan cancelled long ago. Still, she couldn't bring herself to throw it away. Some nights, she would find herself turning it over in her hands, running her thumb across the worn glass, as if expecting it to vibrate with one of his texts. Tonight was one of those nights. Mary had spent the day in quiet routine, grocery shopping, folding laundry, watching old reruns on TV. She didn't talk much to her neighbors anymore, not since she'd slowly withdrawn from the world after David's death. Her daughter, Emma, lived across the country in Boston and called once a week, but the calls were brief, always hurried. Mary told her she was doing fine, though the truth was more complicated. Fine was just easier to say. She sipped her tea, grimaced at its bitterness, and glanced at the clock on the microwave. 11:48 p.m. Too late to start a movie, too early to try to sleep. Nights were always the hardest. She reached for David's phone, which she kept on the counter like a relic. She pressed the power button, out of habit. The screen flickered once, then stayed black. Dead. Just like always. With a sigh, she pushed it aside. The world outside her window was drenched in autumn. Leaves scattered the lawn, the air had the sharp edge of the season, and soon it would be winter again, a time of year Mary dreaded most. Winter had been David's favorite season, with its promise of fireplaces and hot chocolate and long drives through snowy roads. For her, winter had become only a reminder. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, telling herself she should go to bed. But something kept her rooted in the kitchen, staring into the quiet. It was as if the house itself was waiting for something. Mary didn't know it yet, but tonight would be different. Tonight, the silence she had come to rely on would be broken. And the life she had been living, the life of endless grief, of going through motions without purpose, was about to crack open in ways she couldn't yet imagine. For the first time in years, David was going to reach out to her. Not in memory. Not in dreams. But through the one object she could never let go of, his disconnected phone. The old grandfather clock in the living room struck midnight with a hollow clang that seemed louder than usual. Mary jumped slightly at the sound, muttering to herself that she was being ridiculous. She rinsed her empty mug in the sink, the scrape of porcelain against steel echoing in the stillness. She was halfway up the stairs when she heard it. A vibration. Mary froze. It was faint, muffled, but unmistakable, the low, buzzing rattle of a phone vibrating against a hard surface. Her eyes flicked to the counter. David's phone. The dead phone. Her heart gave a painful thud. The device was glowing. The cracked screen, which hadn't lit up in years, now shone with a dim, ghostly blue. The name flashing across it made her stomach drop. Incoming call, David Carson. For several seconds, she couldn't move. Her breath caught in her throat, her mind screaming at her that this wasn't possible. The number had been disconnected years ago. She'd kept the phone only because she couldn't bear to throw it away. She whispered aloud, almost angrily, "This isn't real." But the phone buzzed again. And again. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The vibration ran through her skin like a current, unnatural and heavy. With a mixture of fear and desperation, she swiped the screen. "Hello?" Her voice cracked. For a moment, there was only static. A sharp hiss, like the breath of something too close to the speaker. She nearly hung up, her chest tightening with panic. Then she heard it. "Mary." The voice was low, rasping, distorted by static. Yet underneath, buried in the broken signal, was something achingly familiar. Her knees weakened. She gripped the edge of the counter for balance. "David?" The line crackled, swallowing the name. Then came the words that chilled her to the bone. "I'm not dead." They buried the truth. Mary's blood ran cold. She pressed the phone tighter to her ear, as if she could pull him closer. "What are you talking about? Who is this?" Silence, except for the faint static. Then, barely audible, another whisper. "Don't trust them. Look beneath the oak." The line went dead. Mary pulled the phone away, staring at the lifeless screen. The glow was gone. The battery icon still showed empty, the device as dead as it had always been. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She tried to steady her breathing, telling herself it was a prank. Someone had hacked the old phone, somehow spoofed David's number, found a way to torment her. But who? And why now, after 5 years? She dialed the number back. "This number is not in service," an automated voice replied before the call cut off. Mary set the phone down like it was poisonous. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She tried to rationalize. Maybe she was overtired. Maybe her mind was playing tricks. Grief had strange ways of haunting people, she knew that better than anyone. But the words, those words, echoed in her skull with brutal clarity. "I'm not dead." They buried the truth. She thought of the police reports, the closed casket, the charred wreckage of David's car. She thought of how quickly the case had been dismissed as accidental, how neatly it had all been wrapped up. She remembered standing at the crash site, staring at the blackened earth, asking questions no one seemed eager to answer. Mary backed away from the counter, refusing to look at the phone. Her body begged her to run upstairs, hide under the covers, and forget what had just happened. But deep down, a colder, sharper part of her knew, this was no hallucination. Something, or someone, had just reached across the barrier of 5 years to speak to her. And whatever truth lay beneath it all, she wasn't sure she wanted to uncover. That night, sleep never came. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, every tick of the clock dragging her closer to dawn. Her mind replayed the rasping voice again and again, clinging to each syllable, testing it against her memories of David. The grief she thought she had buried deep inside cracked open again, raw and bleeding. For the first time in years, Mary wasn't just mourning. She was questioning. When the sun finally rose, pale and weak through the blinds, the phone sat silently on the counter downstairs. Still dead. Still impossible. Yet Mary knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that it would ring again. Morning sunlight poured weakly through the blinds, but it did little to chase away the unease that clung to Mary's chest. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the impossible had happened just hours before. A half-eaten piece of toast lay untouched on her plate. She wasn't hungry. Her eyes kept darting to the counter, to the silent black rectangle resting there like a dormant snake. David's phone. It hadn't moved. It hadn't lit up again. But Mary couldn't look at it without feeling her stomach twist. She had replayed the event 100 times in her head since dawn. Every vibration, every flicker of light, every syllable of that rasping voice. And still, her rational mind clawed for an explanation. Phones glitched all the time. Hackers could spoof numbers, imitate voices, play cruel tricks. That had to be it. Some disturbed stranger had found a way to get into her head. And yet, her body remembered things her mind tried to dismiss. The cold weight of the phone in her hand, the strange energy thrumming against her skin, the aching familiarity in the distorted voice. She could almost smell David's cologne when she closed her eyes. "Stop it," she muttered to herself. She pushed her plate away, stood, and grabbed her coat. She needed air. Outside, Willow Creek bustled with its usual weekday rhythms. Children dragged backpacks down the sidewalk. A mail truck rolled past. Life went on, utterly normal, as if the universe hadn't shifted for her in the middle of the night. Mary walked quickly, almost angrily, her breath fogging in the autumn chill. She hated herself for even entertaining the idea that it had been David. He was gone. She had seen his coffin lowered into the earth. She had stood beside Emma, clutching her daughter's shaking hand. There had been no body to view, the fire had left little more than ash and fragments, but there had been a death certificate, a funeral, condolences whispered over casseroles. Dead means dead, she told herself aloud. A man walking his dog gave her a curious glance. She pulled her coat tighter and quickened her pace. But the words on the phone would not leave her alone. "I'm not dead." They buried the truth. The phrasing was strange. Not just, "I'm alive," not, "help me." They buried the truth. It sounded deliberate. Almost rehearsed. Mary shook her head. She was spiraling. She needed perspective. That afternoon, she drove into town to meet her friend, Linda, at the cafe they sometimes frequented. Linda had been her neighbor for 20 years, a warm, talkative woman who had done her best to coax Mary out of her shell after David's death. "You look pale, hon," Linda said as Mary slid into the booth across from her. "Are you sleeping at all?" "Not really." Mary stirred her coffee without drinking it. Her hands wouldn't stop fidgeting. "Linda, can I ask you something?" "Hypothetically?" Linda raised an eyebrow. "Hypothetically, sure. If you got a phone call from someone who died years ago, like, if their number popped up on your phone, what would you think?" Linda blinked, then chuckled uneasily. "Well, I'd think I was dreaming. Or that someone had a sick sense of humor." "Why?" "No reason," Mary said quickly, her eyes darting to the window. "Just, wondering." Linda reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You've been through a lot, Mary. Grief does strange things to the brain. Don't be ashamed if you're hearing things, or imagining things. It's normal." Mary forced a smile, but the reassurance landed like a stone in her gut. Imagining things. Was that all this was? On the drive home, she tried to convince herself Linda was right. She was overtired, isolated, still carrying grief heavier than she wanted to admit. Maybe the call had been some mix of a dream and her mind filling in the blanks. That made sense. That had to make sense. But when she pulled into her driveway, her eyes were drawn immediately to the oak tree in her front yard. Its sprawling branches had been bare for weeks, its roots thick and knotted. She had lived beside it for decades without ever really seeing it. Now the words whispered in the static came rushing back, "Look beneath the oak." Mary's throat tightened. She tore her gaze away and hurried inside, slamming the door behind her. The phone sat where she had left it, lifeless and silent. She shoved it into a drawer, as if that might seal the nightmare away. "Dead means dead," she whispered again, her voice breaking. But even as she said it, she knew she was lying to herself. Mark stared at his phone, knuckles white as he gripped it tighter than he realized. The screen had gone dark again, returning to its normal, innocuous state. But he couldn't shake the weight of what he had just heard, a whisper that knew his name. The logical part of his brain scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone spoofed the number, used some kind of app to fake the disconnected tone and splice in creepy whispers. But another part of him, the part that had tightened when the caller said, "Mark," felt a cold certainty that it wasn't a trick. He poured another whiskey, ignoring how badly his hands shook. He told himself to delete the call log, to let it go. But instead, he opened his phone again. No trace of the call. No incoming number, no record at all. That made his chest tighten more than the whisper itself. If there's no record, how did it happen? Sleep was impossible that night. Mark sat on the couch, half watching the shadows shift in the corners of his living room, ears straining for the smallest sound. Every creak of the floorboards above made him glance upward. Every groan of the pipes sounded like words stretched thin. By 3 a.m., exhaustion pinned his eyelids heavy. He finally stumbled to bed, leaving the phone on his nightstand. That was when the phone rang again. The shrill vibration cut through the dark silence. Mark bolted upright, heart hammering against his ribs. His phone glowed with an unknown number. Same as before, it displayed only, disconnected. This time, he didn't hesitate. He answered. "Hello." Static flooded his ear. Then, the faintest voice, low, raw, as though dragged through broken glass. "Why, did you leave me?" Mark's blood ran cold. He gripped the phone so hard his wrist ached. "Who is this?" His voice cracked. "How the hell do you know my name?" There was no direct reply. Only a long, ragged inhale, followed by a series of soft clicks, like fingernails tapping a wooden surface. "Stop it!" Mark barked, fear tipping into anger. "Tell me who you are." The whisper came again, closer this time, filling his ear as though the voice were pressed right against his skin. "I remember the river." Mark froze. His entire body seemed to ice over. The river. Suddenly, he wasn't in his dark bedroom anymore. He was back in his 20s, standing on the crumbling bridge just outside his hometown. Late summer. A humid night. The taste of cheap beer on his tongue. And the sound, the unforgettable sound, of rushing water below. He hadn't thought about that night in years. He had tried not to. Mark yanked the phone away from his ear, but the whisper didn't stop. It crawled from the speaker into the room itself, seeping through the walls. "The river took me," the voice hissed. "And you let it." His stomach lurched violently. He wanted to scream back, to deny it. But the words jammed in his throat. Because deep down, Mark already knew who it was. Before he could react, the line cut. The phone fell silent, screen black. Mark sat frozen in bed, drenched in sweat. His mind reeled, each thought crashing into the next. If the voice was who he thought it was, if it really was him, then this wasn't a prank. This wasn't even possible. But the voice knew about the river. And no one else knew. Not his wife. Not his friends. It was the one thing he had buried so deep he prayed time itself would erase it. His hand trembled as he reached for the phone again. No missed calls. No log. No proof. Just the ringing echo of a dead man's voice in his ear. Mark didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat upright against the headboard, the phone clutched in his hand as though keeping it close would somehow give him control. But dawn crept in anyway, and with the sunlight came no answers, only a sharper clarity about how real the call had been. He showered, dressed, and tried to force himself into the routine of a normal day. Coffee. Emails. A stack of bills. But beneath it all, his thoughts circled back to the same place, the river. He hadn't set foot near it in almost 2 decades. It wasn't just the river, of course, it was what had happened there. Or, more accurately, what he had done. By noon, Mark couldn't resist anymore. He grabbed his keys and drove. The road leading out of town hadn't changed much. The same rusting guardrails. The same faded graffiti sprayed across the back of old signs. And when he reached the bridge, his stomach knotted so violently he thought he might vomit. The river roared beneath, swollen from last week's storms. He stood at the edge of the bridge, gripping the railing so hard the metal dug into his palms. For a long moment, he simply stared at the water. Memories flickered like lightning in his head, shouts, splashes, the sickening sound of silence that followed. Don't think about it. Don't say his name. But the name came anyway. Ryan. Mark's oldest friend. His partner in everything stupid and reckless. The one person who had never let him down, until that night. The night they'd both been drunk, daring each other to climb higher on the bridge. The night Ryan had slipped, arms flailing, plunging into the current below. Mark could still see his face when he surfaced, coughing and panicked. He'd screamed for help. Mark had frozen, heart slamming, body locked by fear. He hadn't jumped in. He hadn't run for help. He had just stood there, watching, until the river swallowed his best friend whole. And then he told everyone a different story. A story where he tried. Where it was too late. Where it wasn't his fault. But Ryan's voice from the disconnected number didn't care about stories. Mark backed away from the bridge, throat dry, lungs burning. He got in his car, slammed the door, and sat there trembling. He told himself he was losing his mind. Trauma, stress, maybe early onset psychosis. There had to be a rational explanation. The phone buzzed. He jumped so hard the keys clattered from his hands. The screen lit up again. Disconnected. No, 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 he whispered, but his thumb moved on its own, sliding across the screen. This time, there was no static. No whisper. Just the rush of water, roaring directly into his ear. Mark gasped and pulled the phone away, but the sound didn't stop. It filled the car, echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. He clamped his hands over his ears, but still the current surged, as if he were inside it. And then Ryan's voice, crystal clear. You left me, Mark. Mark's vision blurred. His chest heaved, sweat pouring down his back. I didn't mean. You watched me drown. The voice wasn't angry. That was what made it unbearable. It was flat, resigned, like a truth carved in stone. The sound cut off. The car was silent again, except for Mark's ragged breathing. His phone sat black in his lap, as though it had never rung. Mark slammed his fist against the steering wheel, a raw yell ripping from his throat. His whole body shook. For years, he had buried Ryan under lies and silence. But the river hadn't forgotten. And now, somehow, neither had Ryan. Mark didn't know what this was, a haunting, a punishment, or his own guilt clawing back to life. But he did know one thing, it wasn't going to stop. Not until he faced the truth. Mark drove home in a fog, gripping the wheel like it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. His knuckles were white, his jaw clenched. The voice hadn't been a dream. He knew what he'd heard. But how was that possible? Ryan had been dead for nearly 20 years. By the time he reached his driveway, Mark's stomach was twisting so violently he could barely breathe. He killed the engine and sat there in silence, forehead pressed to the steering wheel. His phone was still on the passenger seat, black and silent, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike again. He couldn't tell anyone. Not yet. Who would believe him? My dead friend called me from a disconnected number. They'd laugh, or worse, look at him with that quiet pity reserved for unstable men. Still, he needed something. Proof. Clarity. A sign that this wasn't all just his own brain poisoning him from the inside. So that night, he went back to the river. The sky was a deep indigo when he parked near the bridge. The street lamps cast sickly yellow pools across the pavement, and the water below reflected nothing but darkness. The sound of it made his chest tighten. Mark stood there, staring down at the black current. He wanted to yell into the night, to beg Ryan's ghost for forgiveness. But the words stuck. And then, he wasn't alone. Across the bridge, near the tree lean, a figure stood. Mark froze. It was a woman, dressed in a pale gray coat that caught the dim light, hair long and dark, blowing in the wind. She was turned slightly away from him, looking toward the water. "Hey!" Mark called, his voice breaking. She didn't flinch. Didn't turn. He started toward her, shoes crunching against the asphalt. The closer he got, the colder the air seemed to become. When he was only a few feet away, she finally shifted. Slowly, she turned her face toward him. And Mark's breath caught. Her features were pale, almost translucent, her eyes darker than the night around them. For a second, he thought he could see the river through her. "You can't run from it," she said softly. Mark stumbled back. What? "The river doesn't forget," the woman whispered. "And neither does he." Her lips barely moved, but her voice was everywhere, threading through the rush of water and the thrum of his heartbeat. Mark shook his head violently. "This isn't real. You're not real." But when he blinked, she was gone. The space where she had stood was empty, the tree leaned silent. Only the river moved, restless and endless. Mark's knees buckled. He grabbed the railing to steady himself, breath shuddering out of his chest. He had spent 20 years convincing himself that night had been an accident, a mistake. But now it was clear. Something wanted him to remember. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Mark's hand trembled as he pulled it out. Screen glowing, one word staring back at him, disconnected. He almost dropped it, but his thumb betrayed him again, pressing answer. This time, there was no static, no rush of water. Just a voice. Ryan's voice. "I wasn't alone, Mark." Mark swallowed hard, tears pricking his eyes. I know. I should've." But Ryan cut him off. Someone else was there. And then the line went dead. Mark stood frozen, the darkness pressing in around him. Someone else? For years, he told himself it was only him on that bridge. Only his sin, his failure. But if Ryan's voice was telling the truth, if there really had been another witness, then everything Mark thought he knew was about to unravel. He stared into the water, his reflection fractured by the current. For the first time in years, he whispered Ryan's name aloud. And the river seemed to whisper it back. Mark didn't sleep. Not really. He lay on his couch with the lights still on, phone clutched to his chest, eyes wide in the dim glow of the lamp. Every creak of the house made his pulse spike. Every shadow seemed to shift. Someone else was there. The words wouldn't leave him. He kept replaying that night, combing through his memory for any detail he might have missed. But every time, he saw only Ryan, wet, terrified, begging, and himself, frozen in cowardice. He had never allowed himself to ask if anyone else might have been there. Maybe because he didn't want to face the possibility of another pair of eyes watching his failure. By dawn, he knew what he had to do. If someone else had seen, then someone else might have answers. Or at least confirmation that this wasn't just his guilty mind unraveling. So Mark started with the obvious, the records. He drove to the public library, a place he hadn't set foot in since college. The air smelled of dust and old paper, the silence broken only by the faint hum of computers. He requested copies of the old police reports, the incident that had been written off as a tragic drowning. When the file landed in his hands, his fingers trembled. He flipped through quickly, statements, timelines, photographs of the river, even a grainy image of Ryan's car parked near the bridge. And then he froze. There it was. A witness statement. Not just his. Someone else had reported being in the area that night. The name was smudged, almost illegible from years of poor photocopying, but he could make it out, Claire Winters. Mark's heart pounded. He didn't remember a Claire Winters. Didn't remember anyone at all. Yet here was her statement, tucked inside the file, her words short but damning. I saw two figures on the bridge. One fell. The other didn't jump. His blood turned to ice. She had seen. She had known. Why hadn't anyone ever questioned her further? Why hadn't he known she existed? Mark shoved the papers into his bag and left the library in a daze. He sat in his car for a long time, staring at the name scrawled on the page. His reflection in the windshield looked pale, almost ghostly, like the woman he'd seen by the river. Claire Winters. He pulled out his phone and searched. There were hits, an address, a phone number, even a picture from an old community newsletter. She looked older now, but the eyes were sharp, piercing, like someone who noticed everything. Mark's thumb hovered over the number. He wanted to call. Needed to call. But his stomach twisted at the thought. Before he could decide, his phone buzzed. His heart lurched. Screen lighting up. Disconnected. Mark's throat went dry. His finger twitched toward decline, but once again, instinct betrayed him. He answered. The silence stretched at first. Then, breathing. Steady. Familiar. Mark. Ryan's voice again. Low. Heavy with something that felt like disappointment. You found her. Mark's chest constricted. Who is she? Why didn't you tell me, why didn't you? You should have saved me. The words cut like glass. Mark's vision blurred. He wanted to scream, to beg, to explain, but his voice failed. The line crackled, then went dead. Mark sat there trembling, phone slick in his palm. He was no closer to answers. But one thing was clear, Claire Winters hadn't just been a random witness. She was part of this. And if he wanted the calls to stop, if he wanted to understand what really happened that night, he had to find her. No more running. Mark started the car, gripping the wheel tight. He whispered into the empty silence. Ryan. I'm going to the truth. Whatever it takes. The river roared in his memory, but for the first time, he wasn't just drowning in guilt. He had a direction. A name. And maybe, just maybe, the chance at redemption. It took Mark half a day to work up the courage to drive across town. Claire Winters lived in a weathered two-story house at the edge of a quiet neighborhood. The yard was overgrown, the paint peeling, but a faint light glowed in the upstairs window. Mark sat in his car at the curb, gripping the steering wheel. He must have rehearsed his approach a dozen times, each one collapsing under the weight of nerves. What was he supposed to say? Hi, I'm the man who watched his best friend drown 20 years ago. I think you saw me. And now the dead guy is calling me on my phone. His palms were slick with sweat. Still, he forced himself out of the car and up the cracked front walkway. When he rang the bell, it was a long moment before the door creaked open. Claire Winters was older than the picture he had seen online, her hair streaked with gray, lines etched deep around her mouth and eyes. But those eyes were still sharp, still piercing, and when they landed on him, her expression tightened. You, she said. Mark's breath caught. You remember me? She didn't answer, just stood there in silence, studying him like a specimen under glass. Finally, she stepped aside. Come in. The living room smelled faintly of dust and old books. Every surface was crowded with stacks of paper, photographs, even clippings pinned to corkboards. It looked less like a home and more like the inside of an archive. Mark sat stiffly on the edge of the couch while Claire lowered herself into the armchair opposite him. Her gaze never wavered. You shouldn't have come here, she said flatly. Mark swallowed. I found your name in the report. I didn't know anyone else was there that night. Her jaw tightened. I told the police what I saw. They didn't care. Said it was too dark, too far away. Just a drowning, they said. Nothing to investigate. Her voice cracked slightly, but her eyes stayed hard. Mark leaned forward, desperation bleeding through his words. Please, Claire. I need to know what you saw. Exactly what you saw. She was silent for a long moment, then exhaled heavily, as though releasing years of restraint. I was walking home from work. I took the long way, across the bridge. I saw two of you, laughing, yelling, drunk. I didn't stop. I should have. But then, one of you fell. Mark's chest tightened. His mouth was dry. You just stood there, Claire continued, voice low, trembling with memory. He was screaming for help, and you didn't move. I'll never forget that sound. The water. His voice. And you, frozen. Like a coward. Her words sliced through him like knives, each syllable a confirmation of his darkest truth. Tears burned in his eyes. I know. God, I know. I can't take it back. But Claire, I've been getting calls. From him. From Ryan. He said you were there. Claire's face blanched. For the first time, her composure cracked. Don't, she whispered. Don't say that. Mark frowned. You don't believe me. But the look in her eyes wasn't disbelief, it was fear. She rose from her chair, pacing, her hands twisting together. I've been getting them too. Mark's stomach dropped. What? Claire turned to him, eyes wide, haunted. Calls. Messages. Sometimes in the middle of the night. Always from a number that doesn't exist. I thought it was just my guilt. My punishment for not doing anything. But if you're getting them too. Her voice trailed off, trembling. Mark felt the room tilt around him. The truth was bigger, darker than he had imagined. It's not just me, he whispered. Claire shook her head violently. You should leave this alone. If he wants something, if he's reaching for us, it won't end well. Mark stood, hands balled into fists. I can't leave it alone. Not anymore. I need to know what he wants. Why now? Claire's eyes met his, filled with something between pity and dread. Then you'd better be ready to pay the price. The phone in Mark's pocket buzzed. Both of them froze. Slowly, he pulled it out. The screen glowed with that same word. Disconnected. And this time, Claire's phone rang too. The sound of two phones ringing at once cut through the room like a blade. Mark's pulse spiked, Claire's eyes widened in horror. The devices lit up in eerie unison, both screens displaying the same word, disconnected. For a moment, neither moved. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Then Mark's phone answered itself. The line went open, a hiss of static bleeding into the living room. Claire gasped as her own phone mirrored it, both devices pulsing with the same jagged sound. And then, layered through the static, came Ryan's voice. Low. Clear. Impossible. You both saw me. Mark's knees buckled, and he sank back onto the couch. His throat worked but no words came out. Across from him, Claire clutched her phone with trembling hands. Ryan, she whispered, as if saying his name might shatter the illusion. You watched me, the voice continued. Both of you. And you did nothing. Mark's stomach lurched. His vision blurred with tears. Ryan, I tried. Liar. The single word carried no anger, no heat. Just cold certainty. Claire flinched, her knuckles white against the phone. I wanted to help, but I was too far away, she said, desperation cracking her voice. I told the police. I told them what I saw. The static roared louder, filling the room like the surge of the river itself. When Ryan spoke again, it was like he was whispering directly into both of their ears. You will come back. To the water. To the place where you left me. Mark's chest heaved. He wanted to throw the phone across the room, to run, but he couldn't move. Claire shook her head violently, tears streaking her face. No. Please, don't. Come back, Ryan repeated. Or I will never stop calling. The static spiked into a shriek, so loud they both dropped their phones. The devices hit the carpet, screens flickering, then went dark. Silence fell. The only sound in the room was their ragged breathing. Mark finally spoke, voice raw. It's not just me. He's real. This is real. Claire pressed her palms against her temples, shaking her head. No. No, it can't be. This isn't possible. Mark bent, picked up his phone, and held it out toward her. You heard him. He wants us at the river. Both of us. She recoiled. You don't understand what you're inviting. If we go back there, she trailed off, eyes darting to the stacks of paper around her living room, the articles, the photos. What? Mark pressed. What aren't you telling me? Claire swallowed hard, her gaze haunted. He's not the only one I've heard. Mark stiffened. What do you mean? Her voice dropped to a whisper. Sometimes the calls aren't Ryan. Sometimes it's others. Voices I don't recognize. Drowned voices. They all want something. And they never let go. The room seemed to grow colder. Mark's mind reeled, but Ryan's demand echoed louder than anything else. Come back to the water. He pushed to his feet, resolve hardening in his chest. I don't care if it's Ryan, or ghosts, or my own damn brain. If going to that river is what it takes to end this, then I'm going. Claire stared up at him, fear stark in her eyes. If you go, there's no turning back. Mark leaned closer, his voice like gravel. I already crossed that line 20 years ago. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of the past hanging heavy between them. Then, almost imperceptibly, Claire nodded. Fine, she whispered. But if we do this, we do it together. And you'd better be ready to face what's waiting for you. Mark's grip tightened on the phone. His heart hammered, but for the first time, there was clarity. The river was calling. And this time, he would answer. Rachel sat on her living room floor, surrounded by scattered notes, news clippings, and the printouts she had collected from late-night research. The apartment was dim except for the yellow glow of a single desk lamp, casting sharp shadows across the room. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the documents again, her eyes scanning for the pieces that had taken her weeks to stitch together. She was close, closer than ever, to understanding why she had been receiving calls from a number that, according to every record, no longer existed. The breakthrough had come earlier that evening. While combing through archived news reports, Rachel stumbled upon a name, Eleanor Hayes, a young woman who had disappeared exactly 5 years earlier to the day Rachel received her first phantom call. Eleanor's photograph, a grainy yearbook shot of a girl with curly hair and cautious eyes, stared back at her from the screen. Next to it was an address, the same building Rachel now lived in. Apartment 5B. Rachel froze when she saw it. Apartment 5B. Her apartment. Her stomach lurched, and she backed away from her laptop as if the glowing monitor itself had betrayed her. She had signed her lease only 6 months ago, the landlord never once mentioning that the unit had a history, let alone that someone had vanished from it. She felt both violated and entangled in something much darker than she had imagined. Gripping her phone, Rachel dialed the disconnected number again. As always, the robotic voice told her the line was no longer in service. Yet her call log still contained entries showing the incoming calls, timestamps, durations, everything but the origin. It wasn't a hallucination, and it wasn't her imagination. Someone, or something, had been reaching out. She turned to the notes she had taken from the recordings. Each time she had answered, the voice on the other end was fragmented, layered with static, but certain phrases repeated. "Help me. I'm here. Find the truth." At first, Rachel had dismissed them as random bursts of interference, but now, paired with the article on Eleanor Hayes, the pieces formed a chilling picture. Her mind reeled with questions. Was Eleanor trying to contact her from beyond the grave? Was this some cruel prank designed to torment tenants of apartment 5B? Or was there a deeper conspiracy, something tethered to the building itself, something that had slipped through the cracks of official records? The floor creaked behind her. Rachel spun, her pulse quickening. The apartment was empty, but the silence carried a weight, a presence that pressed down on her chest. For the first time, she noticed a faint hum in the walls, almost like the low vibration of a phone buzzing endlessly from somewhere unreachable. She remembered the building's maintenance closet in the basement. Weeks earlier, while retrieving a package, she'd seen a panel of old telephone wires tucked away behind a rusted door. Most had been cut, ends dangling like veins severed long ago. But one line had still been live, faintly glowing with power despite the switchboard being officially decommissioned. Heart pounding, Rachel gathered her things and headed downstairs. The hallway seemed longer than usual, her footsteps echoing unnaturally as if the walls were bending around her. She unlocked the basement door, descended into the cool, damp air, and approached the maintenance closet. The wires were there, exactly as she remembered. Dozens of frayed cords sprawled across the wall like tangled ivy, but her eyes went straight to the glowing one. It pulsed faintly, a soft red light threading through the insulation, alive despite every reason it should have been dead. Rachel reached out, hesitating before her fingers touched it. In that moment, her phone vibrated violently in her pocket. She yanked it out, the disconnected number flashing across the screen again. Her breath caught. For the first time, she didn't hesitate. She answered. A sharp burst of static filled her ears, followed by silence. Then, a voice, soft and strained, whispered. "Rachel, you found me." The call cut instantly, leaving her in the basement with the faint hum of the wires. Her phone screen went dark. Rachel staggered back, adrenaline roaring through her veins. She had confirmation now, Eleanor Hayes was connected to these calls. And somehow, her apartment, this building, and those forgotten wires were the link. But the deeper truth, that Eleanor's voice still existed, tied to a number that had been disconnected for half a decade, terrified Rachel more than anything else. Because if Eleanor's plea for help was real, then so was the possibility that others were trapped in the same limbo, voices lost between worlds, waiting for someone to pick up the call. Rachel wasn't sure if she was ready to keep answering. But she knew she had no choice. Rachel sat on her living room floor, surrounded by scattered notes, news clippings, and the printouts she had collected from late-night research. The apartment was dim except for the yellow glow of a single desk lamp, casting sharp shadows across the room. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the documents again, her eyes scanning for the pieces that had taken her weeks to stitch together. She was close, closer than ever, to understanding why she had been receiving calls from a number that, according to every record, no longer existed. The breakthrough had come earlier that evening. While combing through archived news reports, Rachel stumbled upon a name, Eleanor Hayes, a young woman who had disappeared exactly 5 years earlier to the day Rachel received her first phantom call. Eleanor's photograph, a grainy yearbook shot of a girl with curly hair and cautious eyes, stared back at her from the screen. Next to it was an address, the same building Rachel now lived in. Apartment 5B. Rachel froze when she saw it. Apartment 5B. Her apartment. Her stomach lurched, and she backed away from her laptop as if the glowing monitor itself had betrayed her. She had signed her lease only 6 months ago, the landlord never once mentioning that the unit had a history, let alone that someone had vanished from it. She felt both violated and entangled in something much darker than she had imagined. Gripping her phone, Rachel dialed the disconnected number again. As always, the robotic voice told her the line was no longer in service. Yet her call log still contained entries showing the incoming calls, timestamps, durations, everything but the origin. It wasn't a hallucination, and it wasn't her imagination. Someone, or something, had been reaching out. She turned to the notes she had taken from the recordings. Each time she had answered, the voice on the other end was fragmented, layered with static, but certain phrases repeated. "Help me. I'm here. Find the truth." At first, Rachel had dismissed them as random bursts of interference, but now, paired with the article on Eleanor Hayes, the pieces formed a chilling picture. Her mind reeled with questions. Was Eleanor trying to contact her from beyond the grave? Was this some cruel prank designed to torment tenants of apartment 5B? Or was there a deeper conspiracy, something tethered to the building itself, something that had slipped through the cracks of official records? The floor creaked behind her. Rachel spun, her pulse quickening. The apartment was empty, but the silence carried a weight, a presence that pressed down on her chest. For the first time, she noticed a faint hum in the walls, almost like the low vibration of a phone buzzing endlessly from somewhere unreachable. She remembered the building's maintenance closet in the basement. Weeks earlier, while retrieving a package, she'd seen a panel of old telephone wires tucked away behind a rusted door. Most had been cut, ends dangling like veins severed long ago. But one line had still been live, faintly glowing with power despite the switchboard being officially decommissioned. Heart pounding, Rachel gathered her things and headed downstairs. The hallway seemed longer than usual, her footsteps echoing unnaturally as if the walls were bending around her. She unlocked the basement door, descended into the cool, damp air, and approached the maintenance closet. The wires were there, exactly as she remembered. Dozens of frayed cords sprawled across the wall like tangled ivy, but her eyes went straight to the glowing one. It pulsed faintly, a soft red light threading through the insulation, alive despite every reason it should have been dead. Rachel reached out, hesitating before her fingers touched it. In that moment, her phone vibrated violently in her pocket. She yanked it out, the disconnected number flashing across the screen again. Her breath caught. For the first time, she didn't hesitate. She answered. A sharp burst of static filled her ears, followed by silence. Then, a voice, soft and strained, whispered. "Rachel, you found me." The call cut instantly, leaving her in the basement with the faint hum of the wires. Her phone screen went dark. Rachel staggered back, adrenaline roaring through her veins. She had confirmation now. Eleanor Hayes was connected to these calls. And somehow, her apartment, this building, and those forgotten wires were the link. But the deeper truth, that Eleanor's voice still existed, tied to a number that had been disconnected for half a decade, terrified Rachel more than anything else. Because if Eleanor's plea for help was real, then so was the possibility that others were trapped in the same limbo, voices lost between worlds, waiting for someone to pick up the call. Rachel wasn't sure if she was ready to keep answering. But she knew she had no choice. The night after Eleanor's warning, Rachel couldn't stop pacing her apartment. Every creak of the floorboards, every low hum from the pipes felt alive, as if the building itself were breathing around her. She knew she had a choice, run from this nightmare and abandon Eleanor's voice to the static, or confront the darkness head-on and risk joining the list of names lost in 5B. By dawn, her decision was made. She wasn't leaving. Not yet. Rachel packed a bag with a flashlight, her recorder, a bundle of candles, and a stack of old newspaper clippings she had unearthed from the archives. If the building wanted to keep secrets, she would force it to confront its own history. She tucked Eleanor's missing person photo into her jacket pocket, a talisman of sorts. That evening, she descended again into the basement, the air damp and heavy. Dust motes swirled in the weak beam of her flashlight as she traced the tangle of wires along the walls. She remembered Eleanor's words, "The building keeps us." Not anymore, Rachel whispered. At the far end of the basement, she found a section of crumbling wall where the wiring seemed unnaturally dense, almost knotted together like veins. It radiated a faint electrical buzz, prickling her skin. Rachel set down the recorder and began to speak. This building has fed off silence and fear for decades. But I see you now. I know about Eleanor. I know about the others. You don't get to hide anymore. Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the phone in her pocket vibrated. She froze. The screen glowed, disconnected number. Her heart hammered as she answered. This time, no static, just a chorus of voices, layered and desperate, all overlapping. Help us, find us, don't leave us here. Rachel's throat tightened. She pressed the speaker against the wall of wires, as if bridging two worlds. The voices grew louder, rising like a tide. Her flashlight flickered violently. Then came Eleanor's voice, clear and strong, Rachel, break the line. Rachel's gaze darted to the wires, thick, knotted, pulsing with unnatural energy. She dug into her bag and pulled out a pair of utility scissors she'd packed on instinct. Hands shaking, she forced the blades around the main cable. For a second, she hesitated. What if cutting it unleashed something worse? What if the building retaliated? But she thought of Eleanor, of the other missing women whose stories had been buried, and pressed down with all her strength. The cable snapped. A surge of cold air blasted through the basement, extinguishing her candles and plunging her into darkness. The chorus of voices rose to a scream, then cut off instantly. The silence that followed was suffocating, absolute. Rachel staggered back, heart in her throat. Her phone slipped from her hands and clattered to the floor. The screen was black. Dead. Slowly, the basement returned to stillness. No hum of wires, no vibration of unseen energy. Just silence. When she emerged back into her apartment, dawn was breaking, the first rays of sunlight spilling through her blinds. For the first time since moving in, the air in 5B felt lighter, as if the building had exhaled a long-held breath. Rachel slumped onto the couch, exhausted but unbroken. She pulled Eleanor's photo from her pocket and stared at it. You're free now, she whispered. That night, she dreamed, not of static, not of screams, but of voices fading gently into the distance, at peace. Weeks later, Rachel moved out. She couldn't stay, not after everything, but she refused to let the building's story fade into another forgotten urban legend. She wrote an article, blending the cold facts with her first-hand account. It spread online like wildfire, igniting debates about the supernatural, urban history, and the price of silence. Some dismissed her as paranoid. Others, especially families of missing women, thanked her for dragging the truth into the open. The building still stood, hollow and quiet, its phone lines severed. No new tenants had moved into 5B. And though Rachel had escaped, she knew she'd carry Eleanor's voice with her forever, both a warning and a promise. Because some numbers, even disconnected ones, should never be forgotten.